Stop buying Iranian oil or face sanctions? Will the US ultimatum stoke tensions in the Gulf? And does Donald Trump risk alienating friends and antagonizing rivals? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Imran Khan. Oil prices are on the rise after the United States announced a new crackdown on Iran's oil exports aimed at reducing them to zero. The Iranians say that will never happen. And they're again threatening to block the Strait of Hormuz, the world's lifeline of oil from all Gulf countries, including Saudi Arabia, Kuwait and Iraq. Around 1 million barrels of Iranian oil is shipped through the Strait of Hormuz every day, particularly to China, India, South Korea, Japan and Turkey. Those sales are in jeopardy as the US warns it will no longer give sanction waivers to those countries. The US reimposed sanctions on Iranian oil sales last year after Donald Trump pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal. He accuses the Iranians of being state sponsors of terrorism and destabilizing the Middle East. Rosalind Jordan has the details from Washington.
The U.S. says its efforts to impose a worldwide embargo on Iranian oil is already working. In the last 11 months, the Trump administration says Iran has lost about $10 billion in oil revenue. All this, says Washington, to punish Tehran for what it calls the government's, quote, malign ways. The Trump administration and our allies are determined to sustain and expand the maximum economic pressure campaign against Iran to end the regime's destabilizing activity threatening the United States, our partners and allies, and security in the Middle East.
These demands are not just coming from the United States government and many of our allies and partners. They are similar to what we hear from the Iranian people themselves.
The U.S. imposed oil sanctions on Iran in May 2018 after it withdrew from what President Donald Trump called the ineffective Iran nuclear deal. The U.S. wanted to cut off Iran's ability to support Hezbollah and Houthi fighters, as well as send aid to governments in Syria and Venezuela. Last fall, when oil supplies were tight, the U.S. gave several countries permission to wrap up their existing Iranian oil purchases by no later than May 2nd. But now, the U.S. says supplies are plentiful, and so the 5 countries still importing Iranian crude, China, India, Turkey, Japan, and South Korea, no longer have a reason to keep buying from Tehran.
To conduct these transactions, one almost always needs to participate in the financial markets, and we intend to enforce the sanctions. We don't lay out sanctions that we don't have any intention of encouraging countries to cooperate with.
Analysts say it's important to look at the impact sanctions could have on ties between the U.S. and other countries. For example, how sanctions could derail current Chinese-American trade talks. But analysts say it's just as important to consider why the White House considers Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, and not other oil-producing nations, key to making the Iranian embargo work.
I think that actually feeds into this narrative of this very close relationship that the President Trump has with the Saudi royal family. And of course, the United States is, again, this is the president who looks at issues from a transactional standpoint.
State Department officials won't say just how soon after May 3rd that the U.S. will impose sanctions on countries still buying oil from Iran. But they are adamant. They say the only way to get Iran to change its behavior is by imposing an embargo. And the only way to make certain that the embargo works is to impose sanctions on other countries, even if those countries happen to be the U.S.'s friends. Rosalind Jordan, Al Jazeera, the State Department.
The decision has sent India and Japan scrambling to meet their oil shortfall. China and Turkey have condemned the move, and Iran's parliament has passed a resolution labelling the US military as, quote, terrorists. Let's bring in our guest from Washington, D.C., Adolfo Franco, a Republican strategist and former advisor to George W. Bush and Senator John McCain. In Tehran, Mohammed Morandi, head of the American Studies graduate program at the University of Tehran. And from Beijing, Dan Wang, a China analyst for the Economist Intelligence Unit. Thank you for joining us all. Let's begin in the States with Adolfo Franco. Adolfo, this was a deal that was trumpeted by the previous administration. It was one backed by the European Union. Why has this administration broken the terms of that deal? It was said to be a good deal.
Well, first of all, you had an excellent report on the issues, but let me add a little perspective as to why this has happened. And you have to go back to our presidential election of 2016. I think President Trump, who was elected, of course, as our current president, made very clear at that time that the Iranian nuclear deal was a bad deal, and the American people agreed with him, and that the deal had to be scrapped. And that was very clear. The president was absolutely committed to ending that deal and then to ramp up pressure on Iran. So two things. From our domestic perspective, the president has kept his promise to scrap this deal and to pressure Iran, hopefully, into making a better deal ultimately. These sanctions are not only important, but they're really designed to be part of a broader strategy to bring Iran actually back to the table to do a deal that, from the Republican point of view, and I think the majority American point of view, needed to be renegotiated. Now, secondly, the sanctions themselves, this is a big story, but it should not be a surprising story. That has been consistently the policy of the United States, and it has been, as you reported here, a time frame that we would actually, as Secretary Pompeo has said, go to zero. And that means zero in terms of allowing Iranian oil out of Iran in a legal fashion and through the financial markets. And therefore, the sanctions were actually imposed last November with a grace period. And that grace period ends on May 2nd to let a number of countries transition to other sources of oil revenue. Of course, Italy has done so, Greece has done so, as you've reported, Taiwan has done so, and there are several other countries that have not completed that process or are now in many ways scrambling to do so. So the policy perspective is I think, understood. People might disagree with it, but the president's view is that the only way to bring Iran to the table and to really curtail its terrorist activities is by imposing sanctions and having them work. And they actually have been working quite successfully.
I'm going to bring in Mohammed Morandi in just a second from Tehran here, but I do want to ask you both the same question. I'll start with you, Adolfo, in Washington, D.C. Why should the Iranians trust you? They signed a deal. They made a deal that the international community has said Iran has stuck to. Why should they believe you now? Why should they believe the U.S.?
Well, that's an excellent question, and I think that actually is a very fair question. But nothing is etched in stone. We've done the same thing with respect to nuclear arms agreements and other arms agreements with the Soviets when we believe that the deal has not worked or has not been in the interest. And of course, the administration has made a case that Iran has been actually not living up to the deal. That can be debated. There's no question about that. It is a fair question, but the position of the United States and the current position of the president is just because a former president made a mistake on behalf of our country, that we not be stuck with that deal in the simplest colloquial way to express it. And that is, if the deal is a bad deal and really there is a will to bring about a peaceful solution to the problem, that Iran will be willing to renegotiate the deal. So that is, in essence, the American view, and it is consistent with the president's view, which has been putting our national interest first, and this would require a renegotiation of the agreement.
Mohammed Morandi in Tehran, you heard our guest there. He said Barack Obama, the previous US president, made a mistake. This is a bad deal. Should Iran come back to the negotiating table?
No, it's obvious that Iran will never renegotiate the nuclear deal with the Americans because the United States has no credibility. The regime has torn up an agreement that the previous administration signed up to, and there's no reason to believe that it will abide by future commitments. So that's out of the question. And I think that more importantly, though, is the fact that the United States, being the aggressive regime that it is, destroying Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, starving Yemen with the Saudis, supporting extremists in Syria for 7 years, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, indirectly, directly, and trying to carry out regime change in Venezuela. There's no incentive really for anyone in Iran to negotiate with the United States. In fact, if you look at the discourse of the administration in Tehran, you see that the language of President Rouhani and our foreign minister, Dr. Zarif, has changed significantly over the last couple of years with regards to the United States. In the past, the United States used to, or even Western media, consider them to be very moderate, but now they're probably more harsh in their language than most other politicians in the country, because the United States has basically betrayed the international community by leaving the agreement. So, but I think the United States is also here miscalculating, because Iran is not a small country. Iran is not a weak country. Iran has allies across the region, from the Himalayas to the Mediterranean, from the Red Sea to Central Asia. And Iran has a very powerful presence in the Persian Gulf region. So if the Americans escalate, the Iranians will have no option but to escalate as well, but in an asymmetrical fashion.
But Mohammed, what the US is saying is that you may have stood by the letter of the deal, but not the spirit, that there is much more to be negotiated. Is there much more to be negotiated in Tehran's point of view?
No, there's nothing to negotiate, because the United States is not abiding by its current commitments. How can we negotiate anything else when what we've already negotiated for roughly a decade has been thrown out the window? Well, who's to say that in future any agreement, hypothetically, that is reached will be abided by the United States? The nuclear deal actually wasn't, the Americans didn't abide by the nuclear deal either under Obama either. From day one, they began violating it. Yet the International Atomic Energy Agency has said, I think 14 times now since the deal, that the Iranians have stuck to the deal and that they've abided by the deal very carefully. And this is one of the, I think, advantages of what Trump has done, despite the hardship, economic hardship that the U.S. has been trying to impose upon ordinary Iranians, just like the United States is trying to impose hardship on the Venezuelans.
I see you shaking your head there in DC, Adolfo. I just want to bring you in to just reply. Mohammed Morandi in Tehran is saying there's nothing left to negotiate.
Yeah, well, there's a lot to negotiate. I really don't think we're going to go into the details of what's really going on, but Iran is actually in the process of developing its capabilities to actually have nuclear weapons developed within probably 6 to 8 years. They already have the capability, of course.
But
all
14
this deal did, and this is why it is
statements
a bad
from
deal.
the nuclear watchdog suggests otherwise.
Well, they're not developing them now, but they're having the infrastructure and the development of the uranium and so forth to actually be able to do so. But here's the key to this, and everybody knows this, unfortunately, and this is why this is unacceptable to President Trump, is that all this deal did, and it did do one thing, is buy time for the West, which is a period of time, hopefully, that there would be regime change, or this was the promise here, or somehow a moderation by Iran. So all we've done is buy time. And then we know at the end of the time period of this agreement that Iran would be then in a position to legally and fully develop nuclear weapons. But let me just step back for that's our concern. But let me just step back to a couple comments that were made and why I'm shaking my head. The first is, and you know, Iran is a sophisticated country. When President Obama was negotiating this, you had a majority of the Senate, and led by Senator Cotton, of United States senators saying they were opposed to this deal. So two things why this is important. First of all, and they knew this, President Obama was in a hurry at the end of his tenure to negotiate a deal, to get a deal for a legacy. But the United States isn't President Obama. It is a country. We do not have a treaty. We had an agreement, but not a treaty. And the reason we did not have a treaty to do this is because it would require the Congress, which represents the American people, and a bipartisan buy-in into the agreement, to turn it into a treaty. And this is why, and this was known to Iran, that this was a flimsy agreement to begin with, and one that ultimately would not be binding. And had we had a treaty with Iran, which would have required then Senate approval, which means bipartisan approval, Democratic and Republicans, well, then that would have been a very different story. And President Trump, and then you could use the phrase, the United States would be behind the treaty. So I think that's important. And lastly on this, to suggest that Iran is not behind Hamas and terrorism in the region, I had to say this, is just laughable to most people outside of Iran. Iran is a state that is dedicated to supporting state-sponsored terrorism throughout not only the region, but throughout the world. So it is Iran's meddling in Syria, of course, in Yemen, and in other places of the world that is troubling not only the United States, but to Saudi Arabia, to regional allies, and therefore why they support quietly these sanctions.
I'm going to bring in Dan Wang in Beijing in just a moment, but I do want to follow up on these two questions with you from Washington and from Tehran. Firstly, Adolfo, surely this is just about regime change. This is about, Mike Pompeo effectively said, this is about pushing democracy within Iran. That's the real reason for this, isn't it?
I would hope so. And I'll be candidly, I would hope that we have regime change in Venezuela, where we're imposing sanctions as well. I would hope that we would have regime change in Iran. These are not democracies. These are societies which are oppressing people and are promoting terrorism. And I would hope, and Secretary Pompeo has also said that we should go to the source, which is Cuba as well. We imposed sanctions on South Africa in the 1980s. I was in the Reagan administration. I didn't see much opposition to that. That was regime change driven. Are we going to invade Iran? No. Or Venezuela? I don't believe so as well. But we're going to apply all the economic pressure and sanctions and stand with the Venezuelan and Iranian people and not the Iranian government.
Mohammed Morandi, your response, please.
Well, thank you for finally giving me a moment to respond to a long, very long monologue. Obviously, your guest reminds me of Pompeo, who just recently said, when he was the head of the CIA, we cheated, we lied, we stole. And that's the great American experience, or something like that, which he said just a couple of days ago. The United States was lying from the very beginning when it came to Iran, the nuclear program. Even now, the IAEA has never provided any evidence that Iran was manufacturing a nuclear weapon, even back then. And the Iranians, despite much opposition inside the country, they negotiated the deal to take that excuse away from the Americans, to show the international community that the Americans are not honest about their dealings with Iran. And I think that both the fact that Trump exited the deal shows that the United States is indeed dishonest, and that the United States is not only a bully in our part of the world, but it dictates terms to China, to Russia, and the whole of the international community. You shall not trade with this country or that country because we say so. It is an empire. The United States supports apartheid in Palestine, a regime that even the Democratic, two of the key Democratic candidates have admitted is racist. And yet Iran, which supports the people who are constantly being bombed in Gaza, the Iranians are supporting the terrorists. The United States, just like the United States in apartheid South Africa, they supported apartheid. Mandela and the ANC were terrorists, and the apartheid regime in South Africa was a democratic regime. That's how the United States works. Now, Iran is a dictatorship, according to your guest, but the United States is allied with Saudi Arabia.
It is.
It's allied with the United Arab Emirates, with Mohammed bin Salman. So the United States is not supporting democracy. The United States is opposed to democracy. That's why the United States has helped Saudi Arabia starve the people of Yemen.
Let's just bring in the regional perspective. You are now talking about the regional perspective. Let's bring in Dan Wang from Beijing. What's China's reaction to all of this?
Well, so far, the public media has been quite calm. There's not a widespread opposition to the U.S. decision, because overall, when we think about oil trade with Iran, Iran has been quite important to China. It's one of the top 5 oil suppliers to China in terms of countries, but it's not essential. So its oil export to China account for about 7% of China's total oil import. It's very difficult to replace, but not impossible. But in terms of the overall, the broader economic ties, I think Iran actually takes a very important position in China's global strategy. Because to start with, Iran is one of the major destinations for Chinese products, such as consumer goods, electronics, machinery, and especially cars. So Iran has been the top car importer from China. If you go to a major city in Iran, you see Chinese brands like BYD, Chery, Lifan. They're all over the place, even more so than in China. And more importantly, what I see is that Iran has become a very important ally for China's Belt and Road Initiative, which is not particularly well received at this point, because there has been this anti-China sentiment rising globally, not just from the US, the Europe, but also from the receiving countries of the BRI project. So to get, China needs all the support it can get from the rest of the world, and Iran is one of the most important ally it could get.
But does this affect the US-China relationship, or could it affect the US-China relationship? Will China simply choose its own political, strategic needs over the US's demands?
Certainly, Iran is one important chip, but it's not the most important factor in the US-China relationship at this point. As we can all see it, that in the past few weeks, the sentiment between the two countries has improved, because finally it looks as if a trade deal is finally on the table, although it might be limited in nature, but something will come out. And what I think is possibly the US will use Iran as a bargaining chip. It might offer China some sort of exception over the oil embargo under certain conditions. And China, in return, can offer to import more crude oil and, say, soybean or even pork from the US. So eventually, it became some sort of deal over a third country, and that can very likely to happen.
We are running out of time, but I do want to ask Washington, D.C. and Tehran both the same question. I'll begin with Tehran. What's the next move for Iran, Mohammed Morandi? Is it blocking the Strait of Hormuz?
Well, there are many alternatives. First of all, Iran is probably selling substantially more oil than what's being declared. Just like when Obama imposed sanctions, it was stated that Iran was exporting 1 million barrels a day, but in reality, it later turned out to be closer to 2 million. But more importantly is that Iran has alternatives. Remember, if you look at the map, Iran's presence and Iran's allies' presence across the region is substantial. But also Iran's presence in the Persian Gulf is very substantial. And one of the options that Iran has and that is being discussed now is, just like during the war with Saddam Hussein, to begin stop and searches in the Persian Gulf region again. And that this would be directed at Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Kuwait, Qatar, Iraq, Iran, they can export and import, but because Mohammed bin Salman said he's going to take the war to Iran, and because of the terrorist attacks that took place, and the Iranian intelligence believes that they have determined that the Saudis and the Emiratis are behind it, the Iranians believe that it would be justified to start the stop and searches. And that could be directed at cargo ships as well as tankers that come and go through UAE or Saudi ports. And that, while there would still be exports and imports, but there could be a decline because of the slowdown of 1 or 2 million or 3 million barrels a day from these two countries. Iran has its options, and the Iranians know that the United States is definitely not looking for a military conflict. So if the Americans want to push hard, the Iranians have many options to push back. And I don't think that anyone is going to blame Iran, because obviously it is Trump and his people, along with his allies like Mohammed bin Salman, who are increasing this confrontation.
Sadly, ladies and gentlemen, we are out of time. This will be a topic we will come back to. I just want to thank you all, and thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Imran Khan, and the whole team here, bye for now.